Domain and range of cube root functions. Let's begin with the parent function for a cube root function. Here we have f of x is equal to the cubed root of x. To determine the domain of this function, we first want to look at the radicand. Here our radicand is x. And we can see that the radicand of a cube root can be any real number to have a real output. So the domain for this function will be all real numbers. We can write this in interval notation as negative infinity, infinity, or we can write it in set builder notation to read x such that x is a real number. For this function, because our domain is all real numbers, our range will also be all real numbers, and the range can be written similarly. Let's check this with a graph. So I graphed this function on my TI Nspire, and if I look at the x-axis, I see that the domain can be any number on that x-axis. So that verifies that it could be any real number. The same is true for my range on the y-axis. My range can be any real number. Let's take a look at this next example. G of x is equal to the cubed root of x minus 2. Again, let's look at that radicand. Is there any number that we can substitute for x that would make my output be imaginary? No, the radicand of this cubed root can be any real number. Any input for x will give us a real output. So again, my domain will be negative infinity to infinity. And so my range can also be any real number. Let's verify with the calculator. So when I graph this function, notice here my function shifted right 2 units. But because our domain for the parent function is all real numbers, a shift to the right will be infinity plus 2, which is still all real numbers. Our range didn't change. We didn't have any vertical shift or vertical stretch. So here, again, our range we can verify is all real numbers. Let's try something with a few more changes. Let's take a look at h of x is equal to the cube root of 5 minus 2x plus 1. So again, will any number that I plug in for x give me an imaginary output? Here, any number that I plug in for x, any number for that radicand, 5 minus 2x, will give me a real output. So the radicand of this cube root can be any real number. So again, my domain will be negative infinity to infinity. Or again, we can say x such that x is an element of the real numbers. And what about that shift plus 1? Will that change my range? Here, the range, because our range for the parent function was all real numbers, the range for any transformation will also be all real numbers. Let's verify with the graph. Here, the graph, we have a reflection in the y-axis. We shifted right 2.5 and up 1. And we'll talk more about transformations of cube root functions later in another video. But we can verify again on this graph that the domain is all real numbers and the range is also all real numbers.